12th century, the Third Crusade. Two great leaders would come to symbolize the struggle between the empires of Islam and Christianity. Salad, the Arab world's greatest champion, and Richard the Lionheart, Christendom's finest warrior. Divided by religion, they would be brought together in holy war. Driven by honor, obsessed with fame and power, Richard and Saladin would transform their lives fighting for the sacred city of Jerusalem. Their epic struggle would claim the blood of thousands, all in the name of God. In 1187, a Muslim army battered at the gates of Jerusalem. United behind Saladin, the most powerful commander they'd ever had. Inside the holy city, the Christian population panicked. Mothers hacked off their daughters' hair in the hope that Saladin's men wouldn't rape them. Monks hid their sacred icons. They had good reason to be terrified. 88 years earlier, Saladin's Muslim ancestors had lost Jerusalem in a bloody battle against foreign invaders. These invaders slaughtered every living thing in the holy city in the name of their Christian God.
As they killed, they shouted out, "God wills it." They believed they were carrying out the will of God. What matters is that they murdered all the people, so it was only the victorious that claimed that it was the will of God.
The massacre was perpetrated by a new Catholic army, called to fight the Muslim infidel by the Pope.
Anyone who is not Christian and acknowledges the Pope as the head of the church was a lost soul. And in this sense, they were massacred not as human beings, but as people who have lost their soul and ceased to be human.
The slaughter in 1099 marked the culmination of what became known as the First Crusade.
The first Crusader invasion of Jerusalem was horrific. A lot of blood was shed for no reason. The amount of bloodshed was not based on military needs, but rather to create terror.
The slaughter of the First Crusade would never be forgotten. Now, Saladin was poised to reclaim the holy city. But Saladin knew very little of the remote corner of the world that had spawned the Crusaders. Europe.
Europe was considered to be a cold, foggy, ambiguous place where people actually didn't have a clear idea how to govern themselves, their religion wasn't clear to them, and they didn't have a proper culture or civilization. And what the Arabs had in mind was philosophy, medicine, music, literature, poetry. And the Europeans were thought to lack all of these things.
Contrary to Arab belief, Western society was increasingly sophisticated and strong. Valuing military skill above all else, it bred ever more deadly warriors determined to hold on to Jerusalem. The man who would one day be Saladin's nemesis was one of Europe's most proud, feared, and powerful princes, Richard of England.
Richard was the member of a fractious, violent family that ruled England and northern France in the 12th century. He was very strong through his bravery, through his astuteness, through his intelligence. He was somebody who was admired and respected throughout the known world.
A devout Catholic, Richard came from an intensely religious society, obsessed with Jerusalem. The holy city was thousands of miles away, but it was the epicenter of his faith. Here, Jesus Christ had lived and died. Since the First Crusade, generations of knights had fought to keep it in Christian hands.
It was a deeply felt belief within Christian society at this time that if the land on which Christ had walked, if the city in which he was buried was not in Christian hands, that was an affront to their God, that their God would feel that they had let him down. Also, if Jerusalem was in the hands of men of another faith, the pilgrim route to Jerusalem might be barred for generations unless you controlled that route and the holy city itself.
Prince Richard knew he had an obligation to Jerusalem, that he might be called on to become a crusader. As he honed his skills fighting Christian rivals in Europe, the holy city was never far from his mind. Jerusalem was in Richard's blood. His great-grandfather had been king of the Holy City. His father, the King of England, sent huge sums of money to the Holy Land. Even his mother had been on crusade. It was natural that Richard would follow in his ancestors' crusading footsteps. While Richard was still a child, Saladin was a young man in his 20s. As a polo-playing cavalry officer, he never imagined a future as one of the Arab world's greatest heroes. He wasn't even an Arab.
We know that he was born in 1137 in Tikrit, the birthplace of Saddam Hussein. His family were Kurds. He was, to some extent anyway, an ethnic outsider in the lands where he became so powerful.
As Saladin came of age, descendants of the first European crusaders, known as the Franks, were fortifying their new kingdom of Jerusalem. Their growing network of crusader castles was a clear sign that they intended to stay and colonize Arab territory. But the Arab world did nothing. It was paralyzed by internal conflicts.
There wasn't a unity of purpose in the Arab world. It took the Arabs and the Muslims a long time to work out a formula by which they can actually counterattack. And this didn't happen until after the First Crusade had taken deep roots in society.
As a young man, Saladin was under the command of his warrior uncle, Shirkuh, in Egypt. In time, Saladin would unite the feuding factions of the Arab world and take on the Crusaders. But like Richard, he began his rise to power, fighting his neighbors. As Egypt's ruler, Shirkuh ordered Saladin to stamp out his Muslim rivals. An unlikely beginning for Islam's holiest of warriors. But a twist of fate would change his life forever. His uncle died from overeating. Saladin took command.
It slowly dawned on him that he was destined for leadership and that this suited him, and people were willing to follow his leadership, and he built on it.
Egypt was the richest country in the Middle East, the perfect power base for a young warrior.
As soon as he became ruler of Egypt, Salah ad-Din conceived of the idea of setting up a monarchy. However, at the start, he did not have plans to liberate Jerusalem, but rather he desired a vast kingdom, an empire.
Saladin spent the next decade attacking his Muslim neighbors. With the might of Egypt behind him, he brought Arabia and Syria under his control. Only a small enclave was left untouched. The Crusader-occupied Kingdom of Jerusalem. After many years of fighting, Saladin was the most powerful man in the Middle East. But now, approaching 50, he was criticized by Muslim holy men.
A number of clerics and religious scholars started criticizing him and asked, "For how long will you keep fighting for power?" People were asking him to stop the bloodshed of Muslims. They said, "Enough is enough."
Driven by ambition, Saladin had killed many Muslims on his rise to power. Now he searched for a way to atone and show he was also a pious man. The answer only came to him after a near-death experience. In the spring of 1185, he fell gravely ill. On the brink of death, Saladin called his holy men to him.
Salah ad-Din lived in a religious atmosphere. He believed in the mystical power of holy men and supernatural actions or miracles.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الرحمن علم القرآن خلق الإنسان علمه البيان الشمس والقمر بحسبان والنجم والشجر يسجدان والسماء رفعها ووضع الميزان تطغوا في الميزان وأقيموا الوزن بالقسط ولا تخسروا الميزان.
While listening to his holy men read from the Quran, Saladin had a revelation.
والأرض ورفعها للكلام فيها باكية والنجم ذاته.
He became obsessed with the idea of liberating Jerusalem, and that such a task would bring him forgiveness of his sins and God's rewards.
As Saladin recovered, his belief that God had spared him from death so that he could retake Jerusalem dominated his thoughts. He began to realize that he had an opportunity to do both God's will and unite the Arab world under his leadership. He would use the power of religion to create an indignant rage in the people of Islam. He would call for a jihad, a righteous struggle in which all good Muslims were obliged to rid the occupied territory of the infidels. Saladin spread news of his jihad throughout the Middle East. His scribes wrote of a new holy war. Saladin wanted to remind everyone of the importance of Jerusalem to the Muslims. It was the place where the Prophet Muhammad went to heaven to speak to God. The holy city had to be taken back.
He used religion because that's all they had. This is the culture. So he used what was available to him, and he used it effectively in a positive sense. He wasn't manipulating religion, but there was nothing else. This was the only element which could bring people together and make them feel that there was an ideal they were striving for.
Crusaders returning from the Holy Land brought news of Saladin's rise to power. Richard learned that for the first time a single leader united almost the whole Arab world. The Franks in Jerusalem were surrounded and vulnerable, but Christendom's leaders in Europe did nothing. For Saladin, it was the perfect time to act.
Once Saladin had built up this confederation of people from Egypt, Damascus, and northern Syria, and created this moral pressure on people to join in his jihad, he then had to deliver. There was an immediacy, a need for him to fight the Christians in 1187. Otherwise, the confederation would break up.
Inside the holy city of Jerusalem, the occupying Franks feared the united Islamic forces. They'd written to the Pope and kings in Europe, begging for help, but received no response. Now, in the summer of 1187, they took the terrifying decision to fight Saladin alone.
The decision to risk assembling a big army and perhaps take on Saladin in a full-scale pitched battle was a desperately chancy thing to do. It's not a decision that people took very often in the Middle Ages, certainly not in the 12th century. To risk a battle against so successful a commander with such great resources at his disposal as Saladin had, meant that you were taking 3-4 times the normal terrible risk.
The Franks in Jerusalem put their faith in an extraordinary weapon. A fragment of wood on which they believed Christ was crucified. To medieval Christians, the true cross was imbued with great power. They had taken it into battle more than 20 times and won. Heartened by the presence of the true cross, the knights of the Kingdom of Jerusalem marched out to face Saladin. This was exactly what Saladin had hoped for. He drew the Frankish army 20 miles into the barren hills of Hattin. Here, he had poisoned the few sources of fresh water.
Saladin actually drew them into a particular spot where they were cut off from all water supplies, and they were actually suffering from thirst and heat.
Exhausted and dehydrated, knights began to hallucinate. Without water, they knew they were doomed. Saladin had them trapped. Saladin had spent years uniting the Arab world with the sword. Now at Hattin, he would unleash his great Islamic army on the Franks. He ordered his troops to attack and torch the Crusader camp. Thousands of Christian knights were slaughtered. Others were captured and given the choice of converting to Islam or being executed. No one converted. At Hattin, Saladin broke the back of the Frankish army. The true cross was also his, proof to the Muslims of the supremacy of Islam under their great holy warrior.
Saladin personally, the true cross was a worthless piece of wood. As a Muslim, he believed that Christ was a prophet, but he did not believe that he was the Son of God, and therefore he could not attach the same spiritual significance as the Christians did to this object. Saladin was aware, however, that the Christians were highly, highly attached to the true cross, and if he was going to surrender it, he would want something very, very worthwhile in return.
The true cross might prove useful to Saladin, but the jihad was not yet over. Jerusalem was still in Christian hands. It took 2 months for news to reach Europe from the Holy Land. Word of Saladin's victory at Hattin brought an increasing sense of unease to Richard of England. Jerusalem could fall, and he would not know until it was too late. Richard's worst nightmare was about to come true. In October 1187, just weeks after his victory at Hattin, Saladin reached the gates of the Holy City.
Salah ad-Din wanted Jerusalem, not just because of the importance of the city to Islam. The message of the first Crusaders had been, liberate Jerusalem from the barbaric Muslims. Salah ad-Din wanted to neutralize that message.
As liberator of Jerusalem, Saladin guaranteed his place in history. But it was his treatment of the Christian population that would make him a legend. Saladin decided not to cleanse Jerusalem with Christian blood. He preferred rose water. Muslim soldiers turned their energies to purifying the holy places. On Saladin's orders, the Christian descendants of the first Crusaders were allowed to live.
Salah ad-Din softened the sharp calls for revenge. After capturing the city, he said, nobody will be killed. He banned the killing.
Saladin decided to teach the Crusaders a lesson. That was that when you conquer a city, you show mercy and you show the values of your faith as being superior to those of the enemy. And that was the lesson of Jerusalem in 1187.
For the first time in 88 years, Muslims could pray in Jerusalem.
There is nothing comparable with the restoration of an occupied homeland and achieving victory. Jerusalem is the sister of Mecca and Medina. So being a Muslim and an Arab, a lot of passions accumulate. Salah ad-Din had a feeling of unlimited exaltation, and he became then the main leader in the Islamic world.
With a magnanimous gesture, Saladin brought peace to Jerusalem and became Islam's greatest holy warrior. He did not realize the storm that would be unleashed when Richard of England heard the holy city was back in Muslim hands. The loss of Jerusalem was a disaster for Richard and the Christians in Europe. The Pope immediately issued a decree. Jerusalem was to be recaptured at all costs. In Christianity's darkest hour, Richard prepared to take on Saladin.
Richard would have heard the name Saladin many, many times. He would have known of Saladin's huge success as the leader of the Muslim world, the opportunity to match himself against someone so famous was an opportunity not to be missed. As soon as he heard the news that Saladin had taken Jerusalem, he at once, without a moment's thought, impetuously, knowing instinctively it was the right thing to do, took the cross.
Richard received a fabric cross that all Crusaders pledged to wear until Jerusalem was back in Christian hands.
Richard would know that if he could lead a crusade that recaptured Jerusalem, he would go down in the annals of history as one of the greatest heroes of Christendom. This was his time.
When Richard, the greatest knight in Europe, became a crusader, thousands followed his example. Men prepared to leave their families. The crosses sewn onto their tunics, signifying that they were now a part of Christ's army, led by Richard. Men who had never left their villages would travel 2,000 miles to join him in the fight for Jerusalem. In return, the church would forgive them all their sins, a reward for which many were ready to die.
Crusaders embarking for the Holy Land must have felt an enormous mix of emotions. They were leaving their wives, their families. They themselves were going into the unknown. They were going into lands that they hadn't seen or experienced before. They knew from previous crusades you probably had a 1 in 3 chance of dying or not coming back. So great fear and also a sense of moral right. They felt crusading was a good purpose.
In the summer of 1190, Richard, now King of England, set sail for the Holy Land. Over 100 ships were crammed with thousands of men and horses. In Jerusalem, Saladin realized instead of stopping the Holy War, his actions had inflamed it. He received news that Richard was part of a much wider crusade. The first wave was already on its way, led by the 70-year-old German Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa.
Frederick Barbarossa, Emperor of Germany, was the greatest ruler in Western Europe. He led an enormous army, maybe even 100,000 men, to the Holy Land. He'd fought past the Greeks, he fought the Turks of Asia Minor, and he was poised to explode onto the scene in Syria. Saladin was terrified of him.
But Saladin need not have feared. While crossing Turkey, Frederick fell into a river, had a heart attack, and drowned. Most of the German army went home. Frederick's body was boiled in vinegar, and his bones collected so they at least could be buried in Jerusalem, should they ever get there. King Richard of England would now be at the spearhead of the crusade against Saladin. Saladin thanks God for removing the German emperor. But his military leaders complained that the Crusader threat had not disappeared. Christians who had escaped at Hattin and Jerusalem had regrouped 100 miles north and besieged the Muslim port of Acre. When Saladin arrived at Acre, he ordered his army to surround the Christian besiegers. But the Crusaders were too deeply entrenched for him to win another dramatic victory. The siege was a stalemate. Now, Saladin decided to starve the Christians into submission. In the Crusader camp around Acre, food was so scarce, mounted knights were forced to eat grass. They had already eaten their horses. Hunger, malnutrition, and disease killed thousands and made some desperate men desert the crusade. A few even converted to Islam and went over to Salad. The Crusaders' tenuous hold on Acre was slipping away. Then, in May 1191, Richard, King of England, sighted the Holy Land for the first time.
It was the crucial point in a great world struggle between two great religions. As Richard sails to it, we get a description of him looking at the tents, seeing where Saladin's lines are, assessing the strength of the walls, already the soldier, planning what he will do next. He approached Acre not as a pilgrim, but as a commander.
The starving crusaders lit fires in honor of their new leader. In the Muslim camp above Acre, Saladin sensed that in Richard he would face a difficult opponent.
Allah. Allah.
But at the city walls, the Crusader catapults were quiet. Richard was ill with the deadly camp fever and incapable of fighting. But he knew there were other ways to win a war. From his sickbed, he proposed a meeting with Saladin.
One of the first things he did was to send a message to Saladin saying, can we have a summit meeting? Let's you and I meet face to face and sort this out. Now, no crusading commander had ever done anything like this before. It was unprecedented. The idea that they were not just your great enemy whom you fought and hoped to send to hell, but someone you could talk to. Partly it's Richard's belief that he could persuade people. If only he could meet them and talk to them, then he could get through to them. They could bring an end to the whole business of the crusade on terms that suited Richard by talking to Saladin himself.
But Saladin considered it dishonorable to meet someone he intended to kill. So he politely declined to meet Richard.
I think Richard was taken aback when Saladin refused to meet him. He thought he was a persuasive character, but this didn't apparently cut ice with Saladin in the sense that he, first of all, didn't trust Richard. He thought he would never keep his word. Second, he thought there was no possibility of reaching a peace treaty with Richard.
Saladin could see no reason to meet Richard. But as a chivalrous leader, he sent the ailing King of England a gift.
They were both knights, and they stuck to the morals of chivalry. They did not behave as normal people, as mercenaries. These men of high status, on both sides, treated each other as equals.
Saladin was proud of his reputation as a generous man. He had already given away thousands of horses to his troops at Acre. To Richard, he sent fruit for his illness. It seemed as if Saladin was impatient for Richard to recover. Soon, Richard was well again, and he descended on Acre. In Richard, the Muslim defenders faced a new kind of leader who fought from the front and seemed unstoppable.
The Muslim defenders were facing the crunch. The arrival of Richard meant that the pressure exerted by the Christians was now almost unbearable. They were very, very short of food, and Saladin didn't seem to be able to offer them relief.
From his hilltop camp, Saladin could do little to help. But he refused to let the Muslims in Acre surrender. Richard's onslaught continued. The Muslims resisted for almost a week, and still no relief came from Saladin. It seemed like the people of Acre were being left to die. Eventually, without Saladin's permission, they gave up the fight.
In the end, they forced his hand. They forced him to surrender the city. And this wasn't to his liking, but at the same time, everybody was exhausted. His resources were running out. He couldn't actually keep paying everybody. And he was forced to surrender Acre, at the same time regret the fact that he had to do so.
Saladin had enjoyed decades of loyalty and success. But now, against Richard, his authority was beginning to unravel. Christianity's new holy warrior had brought his own brand of hell to the Orient. It was at Acre that Richard, King of England, earned the title Lionheart.
Victory at the Siege of Acre was a great breakthrough for Richard. It meant that the Christians had been blessed by God. How else could they explain their victory? It also, in strategic terms, he knew would be a big step forward. It would help to break the power of Saladin, would help open the way to the holy city of Jerusalem.
Richard had dreamed of Jerusalem all his life. But before he continued his crusade, he wanted to extract one more concession from Saladin. Richard had taken hostage 3,000 Muslim prisoners at Acre. In exchange for their release, he hoped Saladin would give him back Christendom's greatest holy relic, the true cross. In anticipation, Richard sent envoys to inspect the relic. Everything Saladin had fought for was now under threat. But he would not just give in to Richard's demands. Saladin decided to delay handing over the true cross and prepared for the fight of his life. It was a decision that would leave the fate of the Muslim prisoners in Richard's hands. The Holy War was about to intensify. Both men knew the greatest battle would be for Jerusalem, where their lives and reputations would be transformed. The holy city was only 100 miles away.